Hello everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar offered by Thought Technology. My name is Jon Bale. I'm Thought Technology Application Specialist, and I'm going to be a presenter for today. This webinar in the ongoing webinar series is Z-Score's suite, Norms that Guide Your Neurofeedback. The reason we decided we want to talk about the Z-Score suite that Thought Technology has to offer is because people, frankly, don't even realize it exists. Whenever we show up to conferences that focus more on neurofeedback or brain training, they always seem a little bit shocked that we actually offer solutions where you can have a database that guides your neurofeedback training. Some people have not heard of this, but many people have generally heard of the topic of Z-scores and normed-based training. And so I thought we would just discuss that for today's session, give you an idea of how that can work using Thought Technology's equipment and software. Starting off, why is a normative database useful? This might be evident to some of you, but for those of you who are new to neurofeedback, it might be the first time you hear about normative-based training. So we know that when it comes to EEG, evaluations, training, and the statistics themselves are inherently complicated. It can be difficult trying to figure out what part of the head to evaluate or what statistics to really use for your interpretations. Is this particular frequency too high? Is this other frequency too low? And then from there, how do we go about training? When do we know the person has trained enough because the values have changed enough? How do we know that it's maybe the change is not enough of a change has occurred? These are all very legitimate questions, and this is just one of those difficulties that people run into when they do this quote-unquote traditional type of neurofeedback. Interpretation is probably the greatest difficulty for clinicians because although there's a lot of good clinical references out there, and there's also excellent published work, it's hard to sort of amass that together into this coherent knowledge base. It takes time, it takes a lot of study, and the likelihood is you are going to see many different clients with vastly different clinical cases, and you have to be able to know the subtle differences in terms of the brainwave frequencies and patterns you might see for these different conditions. The normative database is really useful because it takes these evaluations and this training and it really renders it into something simple and straightforward because you're always training towards the norm that the database provides. It lets you know when the value is too high, it lets you know when it's too low, and it also lets you know when you've returned to that normal area, and so when the training is complete and they now have brainwave patterns that are representative of the average. Benefits of this type of normative database already described, but I'll say them again anyways. I mean, we can normalize the brain activity compared to an established average brain, and so it really gives us a fixed line or guided path of where we're training towards and when we actually get there. Benefits of these normative databases are also that they provide a foundation for connectivity training. What do I mean by connectivity training? We can actually evaluate how different sites of the brain communicate with each other, and we can also influence training by letting someone know that these two regions should be communicating less or they should be communicating more. A lot of these connectivity issues, as well as normalizing issues, definitely come up, for example, when you handle clients who have a TBI or they've suffered a concussion or a head injury. Those types of injuries are really difficult to train and properly evaluate because the physical damage the brain suffers, how parts of the brain will communicate less or communicate too much, is hard to evaluate. But with a normative database, it becomes really evident because you can compare their damaged brain to the normal average and really know what regions to uptrain, downtrain, or increase the connectivity or decrease that. Benefits of a normative database is that it also lets us get a better objective perspective on developmental factors. So the brain of a 5-year-old obviously is not the same as the brain of a 30-year-old. And so these databases take into this account because they compare the brain of an individual to someone of an equal age or similar category as them. And so it's really comparing apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges or something like that. As we go along and explore the Z-Score suite and the database we use, you're going to understand how this makes a little bit more sense. Speaking of the database that we use, what is it? It's actually Dr. Robert Thatcher's NeuroGuide database. His particular database was originally developed at NYU with a few other researchers, and then he took the data and he brought it down with him to the University of Maryland, I believe, and then turned it into this application that us neurofeedback clinicians and providers can actively use. It's not the only type of normative database out there, but it is one of them that is most easily accessible to clinicians, and it's just most easily integrated and commercialized for providers like ThoughtTechnology. The NeuroGuide database includes about 800 normal individuals, and they range from ages of 6 months all the way to about 82 years old. Now, what defines a normal individual? Before they recorded any of the brain activity of these individuals, they had them follow through a battery of typical psychophysiological evaluations and psychological evaluations. And so only those who are classified as they have no prior conditions, no reasons to remove them, were included in the evaluation and had their brain activity recorded. We'll see in a moment exactly how this age breakdown occurs. Dr. Thatcher's database allows us to compare the 19 major brain sites of the head, as well as examine how these different sites communicate to each other. So by the 19 sites, these are the most popular and general sites of the 1020 electrode application system. CZ, FZ, F3, F4, O1, O2, all that popular stuff. It's all in there. Statistics that we use for this comparison include measurements of power, so absolute power, relative power, and power ratios, so comparisons of ratios to each other like theta over beta, delta over alpha, things like that. And it also includes statistics where we compare sites to each other, so amplitude asymmetry, coherence, and phase. These are a lot of sort of fancy names, so I don't expect them to mean very much, but just know that there's statistics that really determine how much brain waves of each different frequency category are at a single site, including ratios. And then there's also us comparing the amplitudes and how the different frequencies change between sites. Amplitude asymmetry is essentially a difference in amplitude, whereas coherence is a measurement of how the values change. Do they increase together? Do they decrease together? And phase is a similar measurement to coherence. When I mentioned the distribution of age for the individuals who are included as normal people in NeuroGuide, this is the general breakdown. You can see that on the x-axis, it's the indication of what the age of the individual is, and then y-axis is the number of people. We can see that his database favors heavily children and teenagers up to the age of about a 20-year-old, and then there's sort of fewer samples. The reason for this is that it's meant to be sort of a time or lifespan database where we know that as you age from being a small child, your brain is undergoing rapid changes in development. And so that's why they needed a lot of samples for these younger population groups, because your brain when you're 5 is different from your brain when it's 7 or 8, and that's different from a brain who's 13, and so on. So there's definitely a strong favoring of the younger individuals. There's a general assumption we have that once you hit about 20 all the way up to 82, your brain is not radically changing that much, hence why that takes a smaller sort of category of ages. Criteria for comparing an individual to this database really falls down to about 5 points, mostly 4, but there's a 5th one. If you're using this database, the Z-Scores, you are hooking your individual up and you're comparing their brain to a brain that's of the same age category, as well as of the same sex. You're then comparing to a brain where the recording conditions are with eyes open or eyes closed, as well as what exact locations on the head are you recording data from. These make a lot of sense, and it's a way that we can really compare a brain of similar types to that individual. The last point of comparison are the statistics of interest, but I don't consider this very important because we actually record all the statistics, and it's just whichever ones we choose to show you is what you're actually looking at. Some of you might wonder why we use the term Z-Score. So for the Z-Score application, Z-Score Suite, Z-Score training. I've actually wondered this myself for quite a while, and actually the engineers a few years back finally explained it to me just by coincidence. For those of you who were not as knowledgeable as me, Z-Scores is a mathematic term. It's meant for comparing the numerical relationship between one value and a group of other values. In terms of neurofeedback, it's really just how we talk about comparing one individual's brain waves to a group of brain waves that make up an average in a database. So if you were to think of in units of standard deviation, we have the entire database of brainwaves that is NeuroGuide. And if you are perfectly 0 standard deviations from the norm, that means your brainwaves fall exactly at the average of the same category of individuals you're being compared to. And then as your brainwaves perhaps might differ from this exact average, you're going to be moving away from that standard deviation of 0 towards plus or minus 1. Minus would be you're lower than the average. Plus would be you're higher than the average. The reality of how this type of Z-score mathematics works is that about 68% of the brain population is going to be plus or minus 1 standard deviation away from the NeuroGuide norm. And then about 95% of the population is going to fall between plus or minus 2 standard deviations from that norm. What we're really looking for in terms of evaluations and training is that we want to identify those people whose particular brainwave patterns for their region of the head and their age group fall outside of that plus or minus 2 standard deviations, because they are getting to become the very far outliers away from the norm. To bring this back to be more specific to what thought technology has created in terms of application, the Z-score suite allows you to compare the individual's brainwaves that might be in front of you to this NeuroGuide database, and for you to know immediately whether their brainwave patterns are considered to be normal or whether they're an outlier and you want to train them back towards this norm. The Z-score suite consists of an evaluation where you place the electrodes on the head and we do a simple 2 or longer minute recording. Then you get the results of that recording as a comparison to the NeuroGuide database. This happens in real time, so there's no sending this data off to the internet or uploading it somewhere and waiting. It's quite immediate. From there, based on the interpretation, you can train some of the brainwave patterns. Brainwaves can be trained in terms of a single statistic, kind of like how in normal neurofeedback you might train theta amplitude to be higher or lower, or maybe train 1 or 2 or 3 statistics together. Alternatively, with Z-scores, we can train all of the statistics simultaneously. I mean, this comes out to like 76 different values, up to I believe it's 248 different values, depending on how many sensors you're using. And so we can have very specific training, looking at 1 or 2 statistics, or we can train a wide range of stats simultaneously. The reason why we might choose one or other depends on why the client is there. Again, if someone suffered a hit to the head because they were in a car crash, chances are there's going to be massive dysfunction, and so you might want to train many statistics together as an index. Whereas if someone's seeing you just because they have some anxiety issues, maybe you're just down training beta, and that's a simple point of comparison. All right, let's actually jump right into the software so you get to see what this looks like live. I actually have some electrodes on my head, and so I'm going to initiate the software as if running it with a normal person. You might be a little disappointed to know that apparently my brain is incredibly average, and so it's not going to be too interesting, but we'll be able to see that in a moment. I've opened up BioGraph Infinity, and I'm going over to the quick start where all the Z-score sessions are. I already have my name entered in here because it's important for my sex and my age to be entered into the system, because NeuroGuide needs that for its Z-score comparison. It has to compare my brain to the appropriate age and sex category in the system. On the right, I'm going to choose the Z-score suite, and we're going to notice there's a lot of options here. This might look a little bit daunting, but it's really not. The Z-score suite actually lets us do evaluations training with either 2 channels of EEG, meaning 2 sensors, or 4 channels of EEG, so 4 sensors. The difference just means that we can either be looking at a lot more stats or a lot fewer stats, and it just depends on what you have access to. I'm going to decide to run a simple eyes open assessment, very quick, where I just have to sit here with my eyes open and not generate too much bad data. I've already done my impedance check, and so I already know the qualitative contact of my electrodes on my head is good, so no need to see that. I'm just going to hit the play button. The Z-score suite was created to really kind of hold your hand and help you along, and so we have a lot of these embedded instructions reminding you of what to do. This particular one that I'm going to stop at is where we're telling the system exactly where we've placed the electrodes on my head. And so this, again, is another important step, because the database needs to know exactly where the electrodes are, because it has to compare the correct brainwaves from what site to those of the database. I'm just going to go into the edit menu, and I'm going to follow the instructions by going down to the NeuroGuide, and currently I've placed my electrodes at actually C3 and C4. And my eyes are open, so that's fine. So I'm going to save and close. The database now knows my age, my sex, and where I've placed the electrodes, as well as that my eyes are open. That's all it really needs in order to compare my brain to the appropriate group. This next step is something I'm not going to play around with, but the Z-Score suite actually has automatic artifact detection and automatic artifact removal. So the idea is that if ever I'm, moving my mouth, clenching my jaw, blinking my eyes, and these signals rise a little bit too high above these thresholds, the data will be automatically cleaned. There's no more need for you to do artifact removal after the fact or after the session has been recorded. It just does it automatically. If we see for a moment, if I were to stop talking, that I'll generate some good real data as opposed to right now while I'm talking. So during this evaluation, I'm probably going to talk anyways, but just know that that is actually possible, and it's a great feature of the Z-Score suite. I'm going to hit a key to continue, and this is actually the assessment as it is right now. The client should not be looking at the computer because the whole point is that they are just sitting, resting, eyes are relaxed, and just in idle mode. If I were to stop speaking for a moment, we'd see that this data would actually become more real and representative, and we'd have some numbers appear. What these numbers actually represent is just some simplifications on the data. In review mode, we get the full results, but this is just letting us know some summed up statistics, how far or close from the norm they are. When the value is 100, it means every potential statistic in that grouping coming from my brain is within the norm compared to the database. When it's less than 100, it means that a certain percentage of those stats are within the norm, but not 100%. For example, this 98 means that at this given moment when I paused, 98% of the statistics we're evaluating for me are within the norm. This is just given from moment to moment, so I'm not going to consider this to be a big worry. There's a lot of people who have variances in how their brain waves work. It's really us trying to look for that dysfunction marker as opposed to these little differences. If I were to unpause, sometimes you see the value would go to 0. And 0 doesn't mean that my brain is going crazy and that I have a problem. It just means that I'm generating a lot of artifacts, and so it's disallowing any sort of statistical analysis on them. The entire 2-minute recording essentially lasts like this. And so I'm not going to sit here for the whole time and show it to you because I've actually already recorded a session about 20 minutes ago. And so how about we're going to stop this here, and I'll go show you the results from that, where it's still my brain and it's still the same electrode sites. When this assessment would have finished, it would have just simply asked me to save the data, and then I could go and review the results like we're going to see in a moment right now. So if I jump into database, here's that same session, or that's the session I just recorded previously. And I'm going to jump into review mode. And it's taking just a moment for it to think about all these stats. There we go. So what we have right here is a lot of numbers. And this looks a little bit overwhelming for a person the first time they see it, but this is the core of all the data that we're looking at. In the right-hand side, it's actually the averages for the 2-minute recording. The left-hand side is just moment-to-moment changes, so we're not particularly interested in that. On the right-hand side, it shows each different frequency as well as each different statistic associated with that. So as an example, here in the middle, where it says ABS, this is absolute power, and that's absolute power for delta, theta, alpha, beta, and so on. Then we have relative power for delta, theta, alpha, and so on. Then we have amplitude asymmetry compared between the two electrodes, coherence and phase. And then finally, we have the ratios. So delta over high beta, delta over beta, theta over alpha, things like that. All these numbers are pretty much below 1. A few of them are above 1. What this means is that they're all essentially less than 1 standard deviation away from the norm. All the results from Z-score analysis is always in standard deviations. So effectively, this is telling me that my brain is really boring and there's not much of interest right here. If the values were more than 2 standard deviations away from the norm, they'd be flagged in red, and the system would be telling me, hey, this value is remarkably far away from the average, we suggest train this depending on why the person's there. Because I knew my brain would be boring, because I've done this before, and let's be honest, I've had people tell me I'm boring. I'm okay with it. I'm not offended. It means that I'm just regular. How about I show you a session with someone who has slightly more values that are outside the norm from mine? So let me close this. Now, I went looking around the Thought Technologies offices to see if I could locate someone who has a bit of a more interesting brain, or a brain that, at least in terms of the Z-Score suite, seems to show something that's more interesting. Unfortunately, after checking a lot of people, turns out everyone also at Thought Technology is pretty normal and average and boring in terms of their brainwave activity. So what I did is that I contacted a colleague of mine, and she was kind enough to share one of her evaluations with me from one of her clients. So let's go ahead and select this session, and let's go and review it and have a look at that data. This particular session is recorded using the 4 channels evaluation from the Z-Score suite. So that means that there's 4 different EEG sensors being used, and there's 4 active electrode sites on top of the head. In this example, the sites would be C3, C4, F3, and F4. I'm going to move the session all the way to the end because we want to do analysis of the whole session means. And we can see on the far right that there's all the different statistics we could possibly look at. Earlier, during my own evaluation that I showed you, we only used 2 EEG sensors. This one is 4 EEG sensors, so there's a lot more possibilities. Don't get worried about the numbers. Don't get worried about how many little digits there are. I want you to notice if you see any certain value that's flagged in red to point out that it is outside of the standard deviations of plus or minus 2. We can see over here that there's a value. It represents the beta coherence between electrodes 2 and 3. So that means that the beta coherence between C4 and F3 is a little too elevated. In fact, if we were to look at all the coherences for these electrodes 2 and 3, so the sites C4 and F3 in this example, are a little bit more elevated compared to the other coherences if you look at the comparison of other electrodes. This is an example when the Z-Score suite does find someone whose brainwaves are a little bit outside of the norm, and it's suggesting that, hey, this value is one we should consider for retraining in order to bring it back within the desired norm. I'm not going to give you any clinical context for who this individual is or why they're there in the clinic, but this is how the evaluation would work in order to identify norms that perhaps are maladaptive or not useful for their day-to-day functioning. We actually have one question coming in from a participant, and they're wondering how many electrode sites can the NeuroGuide Z-Score database look at? That's a really good question. Dr. Thatcher's original recordings actually focused on the 19 major sites of the 1020 system. And so although he's still doing data reanalysis because he has access to that raw information, the database itself focuses on those 19 primary sites, all of which we can look at in the Z-Score suite. From here, let's actually have a look at what it'd be like to do a training session. If you recall, I mentioned that there's 2 ways we can do training. We can train statistics as a large group, or we can just train individual statistics depending on what we want and what level of complication. Let's have a look at both of those. So I'm going to go back to Quick Start, and my name is already selected, so we know we're comparing my brain to an equivalent brain. And I'm going to choose Index Training to start. Just so you know, all the training displays have 1 or 2 monitor versions with the Z-Score suite, but since I'm using a 1-monitor computer right now, we're sticking to 1 monitor. Now, I already told the software that where I place the electrodes on my head, and it already knows my sex and my age, so I don't have to go tell it that once again. Instead, I'm just going to jump straight and look at a training screen. So I'm going to briefly hit the play button just to get some data in the system. What this particular training screen is doing, now that I've paused it, it's actually training a large group of statistics all at once. So this is how you train many, many stats towards the norm. What this value right here represents, this Z-score index, is the percent of statistics that are within plus or minus 2 standard deviations from the norm. At the moment that I pause the session, 98% of my stats within norm, they tend to be floating between 95 and 100, and that's very, very good. If this is someone who had recently suffered a concussion, it's possible that at this particular site or sites, they may only have 40% of their stats within the norm. And so we'd be training them to have their stats perhaps go up from 40% to be 50%. We're trying to approach getting various different frequencies to be closer to the norm. And it's a slow process, but this is a really great way of training a lot of different variables simultaneously in a way that's efficient and simple for someone to understand. The feedback component for this is that whenever the percent of statistics within the norm rise above whatever threshold value we set, the animation plays or the music is heard or the video runs and things like that. If ever we wanted to perhaps modify the session to not train every single statistic, but maybe just a lot of them, we can actually do that pretty easily. And so if I go and edit these statistics, oops, there we go. We can see right here that there's a list of every statistic being trained. So at location 1, it's where I first placed my electrodes. We can see that we're training every single absolute power, delta, theta, alpha, beta, and so on. Same thing with relative power and power ratios. At location 2, everything is also selected as well. And then when we compare statistics between the two sites for amplitude, asymmetry, coherence, and phase, we also are training all the stats. But let's say we want to train a little bit less than that. Maybe at this location 1, we don't want to train any of the statistics because they're fine, they're okay. So I'm going to clear them all. No more check marks in there. And then for location 2, let's say I only want to train the absolute and relative power and none of this power ratio business. I'm going to deselect that. And now the system is only going to train the statistics that remain. I'm fine with that. I'm going to click OK, save the session, close it. And now when I'm training, it's only training the statistics that I left as highlighted. So it's more focused, but still general enough according to the needs of the individual and what I want to do. Now within the software, we also have training if you're using online videos from the internet or DVDs and stuff like that. This is a particular YouTube video I'm using for feedback. This is something I've discussed in other videos, but yes, we now have feedback from YouTube. If you're not using it, I suggest you should use it because it's pretty darn cool and clients react very, very positively to it. If I were to stop talking and my stats would rise above this threshold, this YouTube video picture would enlarge. That might require for me to stop blinking and stop getting excited. All right. Let's have a look now what training would be if you only looked at a single statistic. Someone's asking a very good question of how do you decide what sites of the head do you choose to assess if you don't have some other system of doing that? You would have to choose the sites yourself based on priorities related to the individual's condition. So if they have attention issues, you might want to focus centrally or frontally. If they did have concussion issues, you might want to focus on the site where they're hit if they know that. A lot of clinicians actually just choose to do an evaluation at 2 sites and then move the electrodes and look at another 2 sites and so on. And so it's really up to you to decide where you place the electrodes. We do the rest of the work of the interpretation of data and figuring out what is too high and what is too low. So let's have a look at what it'd be if you trained a single statistic. Training a single value looks different because we can actually have an animation directly connect to that value, and instead of displaying success as a percentage of values that are in the norm versus outside the norm, we're really just looking at the one statistic and we're training it towards the standard deviation of 0. This will make sense in a moment. So this animation right here is going to be connected to a certain stat. How do I decide that? Well, I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose which statistic I want. Let's say I'm going to choose the power ratio of theta over beta for input 1. So that's my electrode number 1. This might be something that you're training for someone who has attention issues, since theta beta tends to be a popular ratio for that. So this is now representing that statistic, and when I train, this little gorilla animation is going to have a ball that's balancing, and when the ball is further away from the center, it means the statistic is further away from 0 standard deviations from the norm, and we want to train the ball to be closer to the center. I'm going to stop talking right now because it's actually stopping us getting some good data. So you can see there's actual representation of the value in terms of standard deviations. It's this little white marker on the left, and the ball is just sort of representing that in a stylized way. This is just a simple gorilla balancing a ball animation, but you can choose other animations that represent that. If by chance the training is occurring with eyes closed, well, we can just stick to a simple line graph where there's music getting louder as the certain statistic approaches 0 standard deviations from the norm, and whenever it gets further away from 0 standard deviations, the music gets softer. So the whole goal with their eyes closed is that they want to hear the music become louder. This simple line graph represents when the value gets closer or further away from that norm. This is pretty much it for showing how the Z-Score suite works. Conceptually, it's a bit of complications thinking about normative training, but in the way it actually runs is very straightforward. You do an assessment, you get the results tell you what to train, and then you train many statistics together, or you train stats individually, and that's really a preference or a representation of the amount of dysfunction that might be present. Let me just jump back to the PowerPoint because there's something else I want to say. People often think of this Z-Score suite like QEEG. Actually, most full quantitative encephalographies, or QEEG, use NeuroGuide, the same system database that we use for analysis. So, in fact, it is the same thing, but we are just not doing it at many different sites. The pictures I'm showing is, well, my beautiful face with a full cap on my head as I'm getting evaluated. And this might be an example of results that you may be used to seeing if you look at reference material or attend other workshops, presentations by other individuals. The Z-Score suite is essentially a mini QEEG. We get access to the exact same statistics, but instead of being all 19 sites at once, it's just 2 or 4, depending on what equipment you have. And so it really is access to the same stats that are available. So what if you want to be able to do this Z-Score application in your clinic or in your practice? Well, in terms of equipment, the necessary sensors and electrodes are for 2 or 4 channels. So if you want to do 2 channels of EEG, then you would need 2 EEG sensors, as well as a 2-channel connectivity kit to link the references and the grounds. If you want to do 4 channels of EEG, you would evidently need 4 EEG-Z sensors and use a 4-channel connectivity kit in order to link those reference and grounds together. In terms of encoders and recording boxes, you can use the ProCom2, ProCom5, or ProCom Infinity for any of these recordings. However, the ProCom2 and 5 can only be used for 2 channels of EEG, so you only use 2 sensors, whereas the ProCom Infinity allows you to do evaluations and training with 2 or 4 channels of EEG. In terms of the software, well, you need the Z-Score suite because we've been talking about this whole time, and that's probably obvious. This is just the visuals and how we arrange statistics in the system for training and for evaluating. You would also need the BioGraph Infinity because that is the standard platform that any of our software runs. And one additional item you would need is this Z-Score add-on. It's kind of oddly named, but this is the license that actually gives access to Dr. Thatcher's NeuroGuide database. Our Z-Score suite sends data to this database and then takes it out and visualizes it how we want. However, this is an additional cost because Dr. Thatcher does not let anyone get access to his database for free, and so you have to pay for access to his database. You might be wondering what the costs are for these products, and I would suggest you refer back to your local distributor on what that costs, or you can also go to our website if you buy directly from us. But I do suggest you go back to your distributor first to get an idea of the prices on that. I just want to remind you all that there's always several learning options when it comes to thought technology equipment and biofeedback and neurofeedback. We do offer online or on-site training, depending on what sort of application you want to use. We have a few offerings on our website, as well as things can be arranged through our representatives. We also do run workshops, often at conferences. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about some sort of application we have, please feel free to attend those workshops or suggest them as well. We also strongly suggest for you to check out a lot of good clinical references and resources from other associations like the AAPB, BCIA, BFE, and ISNR. They have a lot of variety in terms of material, whether it's just physiology or brainwaves, and they definitely have a lot to talk about when it comes to Z-scores and normative databases. So someone's asking, what is the difference when we train a patient on the Z-score suite, so using a normative database or perspective versus the normal EEG suite? That's a good question. So the normal EEG suite is what I'd call traditional neurofeedback. You look at the microvolt amplitude of a variety of frequencies, and you have to decide whether to increase the amplitude or decrease the amplitude, and you're going to have to make that interpretation on your own of what is too much, what is not enough, and what is the correct amount of microvolt amplitude. When it comes to training Z-scores, we don't think of it so much in microvolts. We think of all statistics in terms of standard deviations from the norm, and the system is telling you how far from the norm they are. Typically, we train individuals to be within 2 or within 1.5 standard deviations from the norm. That means that Z-score suite really just tells how close the person is coming towards that norm instead of letting you know what are the microvolts in terms of amplitude. Another point of comparison is that for Z-scores, we can train many stats, so up to 76, 248 different statistics, all as a single number, which is the percent of these which are within norm or outside of the norm. EEG suite itself, you can't train that many statistics. It would be too confusing and rather difficult, and so that is just simply not a possibility. With that, I do not see any more questions coming in, so I'd like to thank you all for attending this presentation. If you have any questions that happen to come into your mind, whether in the next 10 minutes or the next 10 days, feel free to submit those to me at jonbale@thoughttechnology.com, and I will gladly try my best to get an answer back to you. If ever you want to talk more about this, or if any of you guys have any suggestions on what future webinars you'd like to listen to, then feel free to submit those, and we'll gladly consider those as topics of potential presentations. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much for your patience, and I hope to hear from you sometime in the future. Bye-bye.